Hello, Econ 201 student. Today we would like to talk about Chapter 3, Interdependence and Against Farm Trade. So first, let's look at what we learned in this chapter. In this chapter, we actually try to find the answers for a couple of questions. The first one will be, why do people or nations choose to be economically interdependent? And then we would like to talk about how can trade make people better off? And then we'll move on to several important advantages in this chapter. One is absolute advantage, and then we'd like to talk about comparative advantages. We also would like to talk about how these concepts similar and how are they different. Okay, so those are the several questions we try to find the answers in this chapter. Now let's first move on to the first one. So if you would like to check the label of your clothes, can you tell me which country or which area made your t-shirt or made your clothes? Probably when you check the label of your clothes, you might find that product or that t-shirts, that clothes made in China, made in India, made in Vietnam, made in Bangladesh, made in other countries, but very few were made in the United States, right? So you can notice even for very simple t-shirt, it also involves global economy, right? However, if you dig a little bit more, you might find, okay, maybe this t-shirt made in Malaysia, right? However, the cotton seeds that made probably from United States. And the cotton probably grows in India, right? And then the dyes on the t-shirts may be from United States, Indian, or German, right? And the lining may be from Brazil, etc. Those other countries, right? The machinery to make this t-shirt may be from Germany. And then finally, this t-shirt assembled in Malaysia, right? So even for this very simple t-shirt, it involved of the global economy. And this is what we like to say nowadays, people or nations, we are economically interdependent. So one of the foundations or one of the most important principles that we learn from chapter 1 will be trade can create values, right? And we now learn why people or nations will choose to be interdependent and how they can gain from a trade. Okay, we will use an example to talk about this topic. So you notice this is just show you the U.S. exports and imports since 1960 to 2019. You might notice this blue chart. Okay, this blue line here shows the imports, and then the red line shows the exports. In the early years, there is no much difference between imports and exports, right? However, since the mid of the 1970s, we notice imports grow faster than exports. So the gap between imports and exports become larger, right, as time goes on. So you would like to say now United States, we always has the trade deficit because we have imports always larger than exports. And this is one of the examples we'd like to show you. The U.S. imports larger than exports in crude oil. Okay, we have other products that were also involved in trade deficits, but this is one of very typical product. You can notice that since 1960 to 2019, imports, this blue line always above the red line, right? The red line shows the exports. You might notice the exports always nearly zero, which means U.S. probably it were not exports crude oil until 2014. Okay, until 2014. However, U.S. imports a lot of crude oil from other countries. But you also need to know that U.S. is also a major exports for many other products, such as the agricultural commodities, processed food, management services, even for Hollywood movies. Okay, so this is just one of the typical examples I'd like to show you why U.S. now are involved in trade deficits. And you might see this type of the statements often in TV, maybe in radio or in newspaper. Free trade might be harmful to our job, right? Or free trade will cause you to lose the job, right? Then once you learn economics, I hope you can think about this type of question critically, okay? We notice that from chapter 1, trade is the voluntary activities, right? And involved in two or more parties. So people, they can choose to not involve in trade if trade will make them will make them worse off, right? So we would like to say free trade always benefit from trading partners. And this is in general, okay? This is the key reason we observed so much interdependence in the world today. However, we cannot say that everyone will be better off from free trade, especially for some people with low skills. We would like to say low skill workers, they might become worse off because of free trade. The free trade might let them lose their job, right? However, however, once those low skill workers lose their job, we notice that our country actually has a very well unemployment safety net to reimburse those people in a certain period of time. And our government also have a free job training programs or seminars to help those people re-enter the job market, right? We would like to say, in general, free trade will make the whole country, the whole society better off, but not everyone can be benefit from trade, okay? So like to say some workers might lose their job, but there is no systematic evidence that shows opening up to trade will harm the workers broadly. In general, it will actually benefit the workers. Okay, so here we would like to use one example to talk about why we can gain from trades. And this example involves two very important concepts we learned from previous chapter, opportunity cost and PPF. Okay, we will use PPF, possibility, production possibility frontier, very often in this chapter. So let's look at our example, our model. We assume there are two countries, okay, only two countries, US and Japan, okay? And US and Japan can produce two products, computers and wheat. We have only one resource, that is labor hours, okay? And we will look at how much both goods each country can produce and consume in the two scenarios. We would like to see how much each country can produce and consume in two scenarios. Okay, we'll compare these two scenarios and then to have some mathematical evidence to show us that we can get from trade. The first scenario is the countries, both two countries, okay, choose to be all self-sufficient, which means there is no trade. And then the second scenario, the two countries choose to be trade with each other, okay? Then we will analyze these two scenarios. So let's look at US. So for US, we also need to derive for the production possibility frontier. We assume the US will have 50,000 labor hours available. And then it will produce one computer require 100 labor hours, produce 1 ton of the wheat require 10 labor hours. Familiar with this one, right? Because this is what we exactly learned in chapter 2, and this is exactly the example that we derive PPF in chapter 2, okay? So for the US, based on the given information, then we can draw for PPF, right? So how we can draw a PPF for the United States? PPF here is a straight line, so we just need 2 points, right? So you can see I put computers on horizontal axis and weight on vertical axis. Can you tell me the maximum quantity of the computers that US can produce? if US use all labor hours just in computers production, then US can have the maximum quantity of the computers, right? Which will be 50,000 labor hours divided to 100, and that will show on 500 computers, okay? And how many tons of the weight that US can produce maximum? You just need to use all the labor hours in weight production. So use 50,000 labor hours divide 10 to get 5,000 tons of the weight. Okay, so are 2 points now on this graph. You just need to link these 2 points and then you can derive the ppf for United States. Okay, so just link these 2 points and then this orange line is the ppf for United States. Now we said that without trade, if there is no trade, US would like to do, US would divide the labor hours equally to produce computers and weight. Then what happens? So if US choose to be self-sufficient, which means now it will divide 50,000 labor hours into 2 goods production. So 25,000 labor hours in computers production and 25,000 hours in weight production. You use this 25,000 labor hours divide for computer, okay, 100, which will give you 250 computers, right? For weight, similar, okay? Use 25,000 divide 10, you can have 2,500 tons of the weight. So those are the quantity that the US can consume for computers and weight if it chooses to be self-sufficient, okay? So totally, you can also find a point on the ppf based on what we just compute here, okay? So this is the US choose to be self-sufficient, and then it will have 200 computers, 250 computers, and 25,000 tons of the weight. Oh, sorry, you will have 2,500 tons of the weight can consume, okay? So this is for United States. Now, let's look at Japan, okay? So for Japan, we assume Japan will have 30,000 labor hours available, okay? So this is Japan's information. I will just write it down. Japan will have 30,000 labor hours available, okay? Produce one computer, okay? In Japan, one computer require 125 labor hours. And 1 ton of the weight, I just say one weight, okay? Actually, it's 1 ton of the weight require 25 labor hours. Then based on this, okay, we can draw a ppf. For this question, it says, please put the computers on horizontal axis. Okay, so I just computed here. So I put computers on horizontal axis, and then I will put weight on vertical axis, okay? Very similar, okay? First, we know this ppf is a straight line, so we just need to find 2 points, right? So can you tell me how many computers that Japan can produce maximum? Use all the labor hours just in computers production, okay? So here we will have 30,000 labor hours divided to 125 for one computer. Then that will be 240 computers will be available. So this is 240 computers. And can you tell me how many tons of weight that Japan can have? All the labor hours just used in weight production. So use 30,000 labor hours divided by 25, which will equal, let me see, 1,200 tons of the weight, okay? So you just need to link these 2 dots, then you can derive for Japan's ppf, okay? So this will be the ppf for Japan. Understand? Okay. Now let's just move on. Very similar as I drawing on this learning graphs. Okay. You can see we put the computers on horizontal axis, right? Weight on vertical axis. Just need to find out 2 points. Okay. So for Japan, we have maximum computers, 240 computers, right? And then we have the maximum weight production, 1,200 tons of the weight. Link these two dots, we can derive for Japan's PPF. Okay. Without trade, okay, if there's no trade, Japan chooses to be self-sufficient. We assume Japan will also divide the labor hours equally to produce computers and weight. Okay. So here you can notice for computers, if we divide the labor hours equally, which means here we'll have 15,000 labor hours in computers production and 15,000 labor hours in weight production. Okay, so based on this, can you tell me how many computers will be produced? You just need to 15,000 labor hours divide 125, right? Which will equal 120 computers. Okay, so here we will have 120 computers and 600 tons of the weight. Okay, so this 120 computers, how you get it? You just need to use 15,000 labor hours divide 125, right? To get a computer. So this will equal 120 computer. Okay, so without trade, you can also find out 1 point from the PPF. Okay, so you can also find out a point on the PPF for Japan without trade. Okay, choose to be self-sufficient. Then Japan can have 120 computers and 600 tons of the weight. Understand? Okay, now let's look at if trade happens, what would these two countries do? Okay. We will notice that without trade, these two countries choose to be self-sufficient, right? And US would divide the labor hours equally to produce computers and weight. So US generally, as we just analyzed, okay, it can get 250 computers and 2,500 tons of the weight, right? And Japan, as we just analyzed, Japan will have 120 computers and 600 tons of weight. So these numbers are the computers and the weight that Japan and US can produce and consume without trade. No trade happens and self-sufficient. Those are the numbers. Okay. Now we will compare if these two countries choose to be self-sufficient. These are the numbers that the countries can produce and consume, right? However, if these two countries involving trade, can they have more or fewer, okay, more or fewer computers and weight to consume? So now let's assume you can notice this is the production under trade, okay? So these activities will show you production under trade. We would like to say now, US, if trade allows, okay, US will produce 3,400 tons of the weight. And then how many computers that US can produce? Draw this point on the PPF. So let's look at how to solve this question. If US choose to produce 34 tons of the weight, can you tell me how many labor hours will be used up to produce this amount of the weight? You use 3,400 100 tons of weight times 1 ton of the weight in United States require 10 labor hours, right? So 34,000 labor hours will be used in wheat production. Therefore, totally we will have 50,000 labor hours, right? We use this number, subtract 34,000 labor hours, we will have 16,000 labor hours, right? And those are the labor hours that we can use in computers production. Each computer require 100 labor hours, which means now US can produce 160 computers and 3,400 tons of wheat. Okay, so this is their production. The production for US will be 160 computers and 3,400 tons of wheat. Understand? Then for Japan, it will produce 240 computers. And we also would like to say how many tons of wheat that Japan can produce. So let's look at Japan. Look at you can just mark these these combinations of computers and weight on the US PPF. Okay, now let's move on to look at Japan. So Japan, I can write down something here, okay? For Japan, we notice it will have 240 computers, right? And each computers require 125 labor hours, which means for those computers production, it will use up all the labor hours in Japan, right? Because Japan will assume totally it will have 30,000 labor hours. And now producing 240 computers here will use up all the labor hours, which means Japan will have 0 tons of wheat. So 0 wheat. So you can notice, I will just rewrite this part, okay? For Japan, this is the United States, okay? And then the production for Japan. The production for Japan now will be 240 computers and 0 tons of the weight, 0 weight. Okay, can you see that? For the US, it will produce 160 computers and 3,400 tons of weight. However, for Japan, it will produce 240 computers and 0 weight. Okay, so those are the informations we can get from this production if these two countries now involve in trade. So you can just mark this production combination. Okay, you can mark this production combination on the US PPF, which will be the dot that's showing on this orange line, okay? Similar for Japan, okay? You can also mark this production on Japan's PPF. So 240 computers and 0 tons of weight, which we're showing on the white dot, okay, on the horizontal axis. So you can see we will have 240 computers and 0 tons of weight for Japan. Now, imports and exports. Those are the very two typical concepts in trade, right? Exports means you produce something domestically and then you sell it to foreign countries, right? Imports means foreign countries produce those products and then you buy those products from foreign countries. So goods produced abroad and sold domestically. This is imports and exports. Now, we already finished their production under trade for these two countries. And now these two countries involved in trade, right? So we might want to see if trade happens, what these two countries would have to import and export, okay? You hear the alarms, right? The alarms is from outside, and then you a little bit bother, okay? So don't worry about that. Well, now let's look at the consumption under trade. We already know that the production, right? And then if these two countries involve in trade, what will happen? We assume that US now will export 700 tons of wheat to Japan and imports 110 computers from Japan. So on the contrary, Japan will import 700 tons of wheat from US and exports 110 computers to the United States. So how much of each goods now can consume United States, and we also need to point those combinations on the PPF. So let's look at for United States, okay? I just put produce here, and I will have the US. I have Japan. Okay, US and Japan. We notice that US will have 160 computers, right? I said computers. I use C here to represent. And 3,400 tons of the wheat. For Japan, it will produce 240 computers and 0 tons of the wheat, right? But now these two countries choose to be trade with each other. So for trade here, what will happen? United States will have 110 computers. This is imports, okay? Imports. I put IC here represents import computers, okay? And export use subtract, okay? 700 export tons of the wheat, okay, to Japan. And Japan similar, okay? It will export 110 computers, right? And imports 700 tons of the wheat, okay? Then using this form, we can finally compute the consumption, okay? The consumption of these two countries. Consumption. Finally, can you tell me how many computers now US will have? It produced 160, right? And then it imports 110, which means now US totally will have 270 computers, right? And how many tons of wheat? It produced 3,400 tons of wheat, but it exports 700 to Japan, right? So totally, we will have 2,700 tons of wheat. For Japan, similar, okay? You can compute how many computers that Japan left. It produced 240, right? And then it exports 110 to United States. So it will left 130 computers, right? Japan, previously, it doesn't produce any wheat. However, it imports 700 tons of the wheat from US. So we'll have 700 wheat left. Okay? So finally, you can see after trade, okay, after trade, US can have, this is the US consumption, okay, 270 computers and 2,700 tons of wheat. And this is Japan's consumption. You can plot these 2 points on the PPF, and things very interesting will happen. Let's see. Look at this table, okay? We will have 270 computers and 2,700 tons of wheat, which will be the points, outside the PPF. So you can see after involving in trade, US now can consume a point that outside the PPF. Okay, so this is the point outside the PPF, okay, showing the combination as I derive here. For Japan, okay, very similar, okay? Originally 240 computers, right? And then export computers and import weights from United States. For Japan, you can notice it will also consume at a point outside of PPF. Okay, so look at this Japan's PPF. After the exports and imports involved, it will consume the points outside the PPF. So this is the gains from trade. You can see originally we would like to say without trade, okay? Let me just say something here. Without trade, US divide the time equally to produce computers and weight, right? So US will have 250 computers and 2,500 tons of the weight. But now after trade, you might notice from this table, US can get 220 computers and 200 tons of the weight, right? For Japan also, originally, okay, divide the time equally to produce computers and weight, you will have 120 computers and 600 tons of the weight. However, after trade, now Japan can consume 130 computers and 700 tons of the weight, which means Japan also gain from trade for 10 computers and 100 tons of the weight, right? So both these two countries are gain from trade. This is the example that we can introduce why these two countries can gain from a trade, both mathematically, okay? The numbers as I show in here mathematically and graphically, because originally those two countries can only consume at a point on the PPF. However, after trade, these two countries can consume a point outside the PPF. Okay, so from this example, we mathematically and graphically to illustrate why the countries can gain from trade. Okay, and now we'll move on to another question. Why do these gains come from? We know these two countries can gain from trade, right? But any mechanism behind the trade? We would like to talk about two advantages. The first one will be absolute advantage, okay? So absolute advantage means the ability to produce a good or service, okay, with fewer inputs than another country. So for the United States, we would like to say produce one computer require 100 labor hours, right? And for Japan, produce one computer require 125 labor hours. So from this, can you tell me which country will have absolute advantage in computers production? Definitely US, right? Because US just need 100 labor hours to produce one computer. However, in Japan, it requires 125, right? So we can say that US would definitely have absolute advantage in computers production. Let's look at weight production. If you remember, produce 1 ton of the weight in the United States requires 10 labor hours. In Japan, it requires 25 labor hours, right? So we would like to say US also have absolute advantage in wage production. So absolute advantage. Absolute advantage here means fewer inputs, okay? Or we can say better technology. So as I just say, for these two countries, US will have absolute advantage in wage production and also in computers production. So if each country has an absolute advantage in one good and specialize in that good, then both two countries can gain from trade. So US will have absolute advantage in both goods. So does that mean that Japan don't need to produce anything? Is it the reason for the trade? Is it the real reason for trade? This is the question I want to ask. Is absolute advantage the real reason for trade? Because we notice now US will have absolute advantage in both two goods, right? The Japan has no absolute advantage. Does that mean Japan doesn't need to produce anything? Of course not. So we would like to say why in our example, Japan would just specialize in computers production. Do you still remember the practice question that we just did and I analyzed? Japan will produce 240 computers and 0 tons of wheat, right? So I'd like to say, why does Japan specialize in computers production? And why do both countries gain from trade? We would like to talk about a different type of the cost. So this cost is what we have already learned in chapter 1, which will be opportunity cost. Okay? So two countries can gain from the trade with each other when one can specialize in the goods that can produce at lower cost. So here lower cost is the lower opportunity cost. Okay? So absolute advantage only measures the cost of the good in terms of the inputs required to produce it. However, we also talk about opportunity cost. And opportunity cost is the real reason for trade. So in our example, can you tell me the opportunity cost of computers production in United States and Japan? Let's look at the example. We will use the slope of PPF help us to find the opportunity cost. For United States, I put computers on horizontal axis, okay? And then I will have weight on vertical axis. Generally, United States will have 500 computers maximum, okay? And then 5,000 tons of weight. You link these two dots, you can have US PPF, right? And then you can also gather slope. So the slope here, this is downward sloping, so I put negative sign, okay? Rise over run, rise over run. So 5,000 divided 500 equal negative 10, which means the opportunity cost, I would like to say, the opportunity cost of one computer in US, okay, is 10 tons of weight. Understand? So this is the way that we can get the opportunity cost. We put the computers on horizontal axis, and then the slope that we compute here will be the opportunity cost of something that we put on horizontal axis. Okay, so this is the opportunity cost of one computer in the United States, 10 tons of weight. this point, mark this number on your notebook. Now let's look at Japan. For Japan, I can just draw a graph here, okay? Okay, for Japan, this is for Japan. Similar, okay, I will put computers on horizontal axis. Okay, so this is was still computer. And this is still the weight. We notice that for computers, it will have 240 computers maximum, right? And 1,200 tons of weight maximum. Link these two dots, similar, okay? You can get the PPF for Japan. So this is the PPF for Japan. And you can also get a slope, right? So the slope here will equal negative, okay? Still downward sloping, put a negative sign. Rise over run. So 1,200 pounds of weight divide 240 computers, which will equal -5. So what does this -5 mean? This -5 means the opportunity cost. I'll just write down things here, okay? The opportunity cost of one computer in Japan, okay, is 5 tons of weight. So now you can compare the numbers, the opportunity cost. As I just showing here, in United States, the opportunity cost of one computer is 10 tons of weight, right? In Japan, the opportunity cost of one computer is 5 tons of weight. So which country will have lower opportunity cost to produce computer? Definitely Japan, right? So we would like to say even Japan has no absolute advantage in computers production. However, Japan has lower opportunity cost in computers production. And lower opportunity cost means comparative advantage. Comparative advantage. So we like to say here, comparative advantage means the ability to produce a good at lower opportunity cost than another country. So based on this, Japan would definitely, okay, Japan would definitely has comparative advantage in computers production. And this is why Japan specializes in computers production. So United States, as I just compute, okay, the opportunity cost of one computer is 10 tons of the weight. And in Japan, the opportunity cost of one computer is 5 tons of the weight. Okay. So Japan would definitely, okay, have comparative advantage in computers. Okay, Japan. Just put Japan in a blank. So we would like to say the lesson we can then hear is absolute advantage. Absolute advantage is not the reason for trade. Absolute advantage is not the reason for trade. Comparative advantage is the reason for trade. Okay? So what a country can gain from a trade? Gain from a trade arise from comparative advantage. Okay? And when each country can specialize in the goods or services, okay, which it has a comparative advantage, then the total production of these countries will become higher. Okay, so this is the real reason for trade. Okay, comparative advantage is the real reason for trade. This will also apply to our individual producers, like the farmers and ranchers, the examples in our textbook. Okay. Now, I think up to now I analyze the comparative advantage and absolute advantage. Okay, can you understand? Absolute advantage related to fewer inputs. Okay, absolute advantage related to fewer inputs. I will just write it here. And comparative advantage involved for the lower opportunity cost. And this is the real reason for trade, okay? This is the reason for trade. This is the real reason for trade. Okay, and then at the end of this lecture slides, I give you the practice question, and I hope you can do this practice questions at home. I also explain those practice questions in the actual credit video in this chapter. Okay, so you can check it. Now, I think this is the end of this chapter. Thank you.